On today's episode, I'll be talking about the original 1984 surprise horror hit, A Nightmare on Elm Street.
You're looking for a man with no plans or programs, and he always needs a chance to hold hands for romance. Or you're looking for the Luke with an old man or cold hands. It's a creature of the night who heads for his spotlight. I'm here to welcome you to Blinded and Random Reviews. No, nothing when I choose. It's Blinded and Random Reviews.
All right, everyone, welcome to Brandon at Random Reviews, covering one unsystematically chosen topic at a time. If you like listening to a guy talk about arbitrarily chosen subjects in weekly episodes, then look no further. To keep up with the newest content, you can find Brandon at Random Reviews on most major video and audio platforms, as well as all popular social media sites. If you enjoy this, please like and subscribe. I use listener engagement as a caffeine substitute to keep myself awake when a child murderer keeps appearing in my dreams to terrorize me. As I mentioned, today's movie is A Nightmare on Elm Street, released on November 16th, 1984, with a runtime of 91 minutes. This movie is rated R by the Motion Picture Association of America. Budget, $1.1 million. There are conflicting accounts about exactly what the budget of this movie ended up being. It was somewhere between 1.1 and 1.8 million. Written and directed by the late great Wes Craven, who directed the first 4 Scream movies that really changed the horror landscape in the mid-1990s. He also directed the original The Hills Have Eyes, which was a pretty solid one, and he also did the original The Last House on the Left, and he only did one other installment in this series of movies, which was New Nightmare, and that one was completely different, and it was kind of the precursor to the first Scream movie in terms of tone and subject matter. For the composer, we have Charles Bernstein, and for the cast, we have Heather Langenkamp, who plays Nancy Thompson, and she was in Shocker, which is another Wes Craven movie, and I can't remember what that one's about. It's about a guy on death row. I know the poster for the movie is a guy in the electric chair, and I want to say like he comes back to life, or I don't remember what it was, but anyway, never saw it, probably won't, but I remember seeing the poster before. We also have Robert Englund, who plays Freddy Krueger. Johnny Depp in his first film role as Glenn Lance, and he was in, of course, the Pirates of the Caribbean. Those are mega successful movies. He plays Captain Jack Sparrow in those ones, pretty iconic in that role. I liked the first one just fine. I didn't really need multiple other movies to watch. I found the rest of them not as enjoyable as the first one. He was also in What's Eating Gilbert Grape with Leonardo DiCaprio, and I believe it was Juliette Lewis in that movie. And that's a strange movie. It's pretty interesting, and I remember it's just a very memorable movie. I don't even know that it's that great of a movie. It's just very memorable, and it has a lot of strange moments in it. He was in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is the more recent adaptation, not the most recent adaptation, because that one had Timothée Chalamet as Wonka. But I never really liked Charlie and the Chocolate Factory just because I enjoy the original adaptation with Gene Wilder as Willy Wonka, which was called Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. It's just better. It's what I grew up with. I don't know. I don't really care. And the movie that I consider to be more Johnny Depp's breakout role in his career is another Tim Burton movie, which is Edward Scissorhands, and I think that was 1990. John Saxon plays Lieutenant Donald Thompson, and Ronnie Blakely plays Marge Thompson. I don't know if her last name is actually pronounced Blakely, because it's not spelled correctly if that's how it's pronounced, but whatever. For casting notes, actor David Warner was originally cast to play Freddy, but he dropped out due to scheduling conflicts. For those that don't know, David Warner was the scientist in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze. He also played Bob Cratchit in the George C. Scott version of A Christmas Carol. Kane Hodder was also considered for the role of Freddy. Kane Hodder is best known for playing Jason Voorhees in 4 Friday the 13th movies. He started with the 7th Friday the 13th movie portraying Jason, and he was in the 8th one, the 9th one, which is just called Jason Goes to Hell, and then he was in Jason X, which is Jason in Space. Pretty terrible movies overall, but Kane Hodder was noteworthy as a Jason portrayer for having worked as a stuntman and actually having the ability to do really physical things with the character. So naturally, giving those first two tidbits about other people that were up for portraying Freddy Krueger, Wes Craven said that Robert Englund was obviously not the first choice for the role of Freddy Krueger. Craven had initially wanted a stuntman to play the part, but upon testing several stuntmen, he realized that he needed a real actor for the part. Other ideas were to cast an elderly actor, but he feared that they would be too soft for the way he would have wanted the character to act. England eventually got the part by showing up at his audition with ash smeared under his eyes to sink them in, greasing his hair back with a dipstick from under the hood of his car, and blinking as little as possible. I find it so funny. I think I got that from, well, it's either IMDb or Wikipedia. And I love that it says a dipstick under the hood of his car. It's the dipstick from under the hood of his car, really. I mean, they could have just said the oil dipstick from his car. They don't have to say under the hood of his car. We know where dipsticks are if we're talking about cars and we know what dipsticks are. Anywho, Demi Moore, Courtney Cox, Tracy Gold, and Jennifer Grey were all rumored to have auditioned for the role of Nancy Thompson. I don't actually know off the top of my head who Tracy Gold is. I forgot to look her up before this, and that's my bad. The rest of them are pretty commonly known actresses who have risen to stardom since this movie came out. Charlie Sheen was offered the role of Glenn, but ultimately wanted too much money, and the part then ultimately went to the unknown Johnny Depp. One of the main reasons Johnny Depp was chosen was because Wes Craven's daughter thought he was dreamy and threatened to run away from home if her dad didn't cast him in the movie. For the plot synopsis, an undead child murderer who was burned alive by a group of parents, spoilers, returns to terrorize the dreams of teenagers as a form of retribution. For the tagline, there were like 20 fucking taglines for this fucking movie. The only one that stood out as like a decent option was 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. More on that a little later. Alright, guys, let's just dive right into the plot of this motherfucking movie. So, I find it weird to see a New Line Cinema movie old enough to not have the iconic studio logo with the film strip sequence before the movie starts, but I'll explain that in the trivia section a little bit more. This movie just jumps right the fuck in with a camera angle pointed at someone's feet, and spoilers, that someone is Freddy Krueger, and he will be our antagonist for the duration of this film. They're deliberately not showing his face and showing him picking up things like gloves and knives, and it just goes to show that no matter how gruesome your background is, you're never above doing a little craft project. Freddy is fashioning the cutest pair of gloves and affixing knives to the tips of each of the fingers. And actually, it's not even a pair of gloves, it's just a glove. I think it's only one, he only has it on one hand. And what I find fascinating about this weapon of choice is that it is arguably the most impractical weapon possible. To actually use knife gloves, even if they're really well designed and secured the knives well to your fingers, it would hurt like a bitch to do virtually anything with them other than maybe scratch or lightly cut people. And I mean, you just have to be more sensible when choosing your weapons, guys. This is Bush League shit, but it's still pretty iconic. I remember I saw this movie for the first time when I was probably in my early teens, and I just really liked it. I thought the story was compelling, and there were some cool, spooky sequences. I'll briefly paint a picture of Freddy Krueger for you. He has a dirty red and green, broad, horizontal striped sweater, dark brown pants, a brown fedora, and I guess brown leather boots. His face is covered completely in burns, and to say his face is horrific wouldn't really be emphasizing how bad it is quite well enough. Freddy just throws on the knife glove and does a little growl yell as he dives his knifed fingers through a sheet that has frankly seen better days, so it's not like a travesty that he cut it all up. Cuts to the face of blonde teen Tina Gray, who is played by actress Amanda Wyss. She is looking in horror around the darkened halls of what looks to be a basement of some kind of industrial building. I don't know. Also, I'm not sure if this is relevant, but I'm trying to grow more culturally, so I want to point out that Tina has a hairstyle that I believe is referred to as a bob, but I would have to consult an expert to confirm that this is actually a bob and not some variation. She runs down a dimly lit hallway in what appears to be a nightgown. I guess I should probably elaborate on or at least reiterate what I mentioned in the plot synopsis, which is that Freddy Krueger terrorizes teens in their dreams while they sleep, so it's pretty obvious that this is supposed to be some kind of dream. The hallway Tina is running down is definitely very wet, and she can hear Freddy's voice echoing around her as she runs barefoot. He's just saying Tina over and over to taunt her. Then, of course, it shows what I guess is a sheep that she can see at one end of the hall, but it's not clear if this is a reference to counting sheep or just some kind of weird thing that Wes Craven thought would be scary. Who the fuck knows? As Tina walks into different areas of this basement, we see Freddy creepily looking at her, but we can't really see his whole face as it's usually obscured in some way. And it's also not super clear if she can actually see him when they show him or not, but to spell it out would really ruin the art. You know what I mean? The set design in this sequence is actually pretty solid. I think it helps that not only is it dark, but a lot of people would feel really out of their element in this kind of situation, especially in this sort of locale. Yet another reason I wanted to point out again that this is a dream is because I would say a lot of what happens in this sequence doesn't make a ton of logical sense. Much like a lot of dreams. We get a lot of close ups of Tina as she's looking around and she's cornered near what I guess is supposed to be a furnace of some sort, and there's a big open flame behind her. She's obviously pretty on edge as she's looking around, and suddenly Freddy just appears behind her and grabs her, and then suddenly the sensation of her being grabbed is what brings her out of her dream and causes her to wake up, and she's sweating pretty profusely in bed. And of course, she does that cliche thing where she sits up straight right after waking up, and I've got to admit, I've had many dreams that shocked me into waking up for one reason or another, but I can't recall a time that I was actually jarred awake from a dream and sat straight up in bed because of it immediately after being woken up. Just as Tina is collecting herself, her mom opens her door to check on her to make sure she's okay because she obviously heard her scream. She tells her mom that it was just a dream, and her mom remarks that it might have been more than a dream, judging from the fact that Tina has 4 slits cut into her nightgown right at about stomach level, and I would say that other than pointing the strange cuts in her nightgown out, her mom seems to underreact pretty heavily to the situation, considering that's a pretty fucking nuts thing to have happen. And in a bit of craziness, a man comes up to Tina's mom while she's standing in her daughter's doorway and asks her if she's coming back to the sack, which is funny because her mom couldn't have been away from the bed with him for more than 30 seconds at this point. But also, this guy is clearly not Tina's real dad, and he could not give a shit less about Tina, as he says this loud enough for Tina to hear it. And then he just walks away as Tina's mom dismisses him by saying she'll be back in a minute. Her mom's last words to Tina in this moment before walking away are to tell Tina that she needs to either cut her fingernails or stop with that kind of dreaming. And I just love how insane parents in horror movies are, especially in this era, because you can't control what goes on in your dreams, obviously. And I don't think that you could really say that it looks like she made these cuts with her fingernails, but whatever. But since it is such a leap of logic to believe that somehow Tina had been attacked in her dream and her clothes had gotten cut in the dream, and that it carried out into the real world, I guess it is kind of fair for her mom to be dismissive. Oh, and I should also mention that early on in this movie, there are a lot of these moments, especially between scenes or during dream sequences, that include these weird chants by children who are jumping rope. And it's basically to the tune of whatever that nursery rhyme is that goes 1, 2, buckle my shoe, 3, 4, shut the door. But they say it all in a much slower tempo with creepy backing music. And this seems to go on occasionally in the movie. It's not like completely throughout or anything. The next morning, Tina pulls up to school in a red convertible with her friends, Nancy and Glenn. Nancy is played by Heather Langenkamp, and Glenn is played by Johnny Depp in what I mentioned earlier was his very first film role. And don't quote me on this, but I want to say this was actually prior to 21 Jump Street, which was a TV show about, I think, a cop or a group of cops who go undercover as high schoolers, maybe, but I'm not sure. I've never actually seen the show, and I don't remember the movies very well, but I actually liked them. They had Channing Tatum and Jonah Hill in them. Tina is telling Nancy and Glenn about her crazy dream from the night before, and Nancy agrees that it is pretty terrifying sounding and is curious who the fuck this Freddy character is. I just feel like she's way over interested in this. Like, if this had just happened, it was just her friend telling the story of this dream, she would not give two shits about the detail. It wouldn't fucking matter to her. The girls both seem to remember the chant as something similar to when they used to jump rope as kids, where it says 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, but they never knew what it meant when they were younger either. Tina says that the nightmare was the worst one that she'd ever had in her life, and Nancy mentions that she also had a scary dream the night before as well. But before Nancy can elaborate, the three friends are interrupted by a guy named Rod who walks up behind them and announces to Tina that he had a hard on when he woke up this morning. And he charmingly mentions that it had Tina's name written all over it. Tina casually responds to Rod by saying that her name has 4 letters in it, and she asks him how on earth there could be room for that many letters on his penis, which is a pretty sick burn, I'm not gonna lie. Rod says, hey, up yours with a twirling lawnmower, and I guess that's the best he could come up with after being dealt such a devastating putdown from a woman that he's clearly attracted to. After Rod walks away, Tina tells Nancy that she wasn't able to get back to bed after her dream, and then when she asks Nancy what Nancy dreamt about, Nancy's really apprehensive about sharing because she knows that it won't put Tina at ease if she shares what her dream was about. And it's kind of like, hey, Nancy, maybe don't fucking mention that you also had a bad dream if you're not willing to elaborate on it at all. Nancy tries to dismiss Tina's concerns by explaining that everyone has a bad dream once in a while, and it's nothing to get all fucking bent out of shape about. And Glenn finally chimes in to say that all she has to do is tell herself while she's having a dream that that's all it is a dream, and that usually makes him wake right up. And I hate to break it to you, Glenn, but typically it's just not that easy to be that aware while you're actually having a dream to just tell yourself it's a dream and snap yourself out of it. That isn't really usually how it works. The bell suddenly rings and Glenn is running inside to get to class, and Tina tries to call out to him to ask if he also had a bad dream the night before, but she doesn't really get an answer. But it's like, what if he did? What if all three of them had bad fucking dreams on the same night? Would that really mean jack shit? Suddenly, it cuts to that night, and Tina is explaining that her mother told her she was going to be out of town for a couple of nights. And so I guess Nancy and Glenn are going to stay the night with her to kind of put her mind at ease. I mean, it was one bad dream, and I'm sure it was really traumatic. And I gotta tell you, my favorite thing about doing this podcast and basically just going back and rewatching movies like this that I've enjoyed so I can do episodes on them is that I usually don't remember everything that happens in the movie consciously before watching it. And I also don't remember what the timeline is for the things that I do remember. So it still comes as a bit of a shock to me when I see it again. Basically, I've genuinely watched enough movies in my life that I can barely even remember all the ones I've actually seen. And most of the time, the only thing I can really remember, if they're not exceptional, is whether or not I liked them if I'm lucky. So, anyway, they're at Tina's house, and of course, Glenn is a high school boy whose parents probably wouldn't approve of him staying the night with 2 girls at a girl's house with no parents around. So the dumb bit we get as an attempt at comedy is that he calls his mom under the ruse that he's staying at a male friend's house who apparently lives near an airport. And I guess Glenn thought it would be necessary to make his story more convincing by playing a tape he got from Rod with a recording of airport sounds on his boombox while talking to his mom. But it also features other sounds on it, like people racing motorcycles, and he quickly has to explain what the weird noises are without knowing that they're coming. And the girls are giggling in the background. What's even dumber is he doesn't start playing the tape before he calls his mom, so while he's already got her on the phone, he starts playing the airport noises out of nowhere way too loudly, so it would seem even more unconvincing to his mom. But like I said, parents in 80s horror movies are complete idiots. The recording gets so bad that there are literal explosions and sound effects that make no sense, and the girls are quite audibly laughing. And Glenn tries to explain to his mom that he's going to call the police because he thinks the neighbors near there are fighting, and he finally hangs up and covers his face in embarrassment. Tina brings up her horrifying dream from the night before again and mentions Fred's fingernails. Nancy says that that reminds her of her dream where the man terrorizing her also had long fingernails that he similarly dragged along things. Huh. Then she clarifies that they were more like finger knives that he made himself, and Tina is obviously freaked the fuck out, and we see Glenn also reacting to the story in terror. But Glenn says it's impossible that they both dreamt about the same guy. But what the fuck does Glenn know? They hear some noises outside, and all three of them go out to investigate. And Glenn decides he's going to act like a real tough guy for a minute and talk a bunch of shit to seemingly no one as he looks out into the darkness. Then suddenly we get an annoying jump scare where Glenn is suddenly tackled by the one and only Rod, who is clearly an uninvited guest on Tina's property. And I guess she's pretty TO'd about it, rightfully so. Rod ends up asking them why they're all at Tina's house so late and wonders if maybe they're having an orgy. Then, when Glenn makes fun of him, Rod just casually pulls a switchblade on him, and I get the sense that Glenn and Rod have a tumultuous friendship at best. Tina lies to Rod and tells him that her mom is home, but he quickly realizes that that is not true, and Nancy and Glenn suggest that they were just going home. And I gotta say, they seem like real great friends given how not into Rod Tina seems to be in this moment, as he leads her back to the house, and they don't do anything to intervene or make sure that Tina isn't in inherent danger. But I'm sure this Rod guy is cool, so there's probably nothing to worry about. Rod jokingly tells Nancy and Glenn that the two of them can have one room and he and Tina can have another, and Tina comes to the door to make sure that Nancy and Glenn aren't leaving her alone with this creep. Then Rod jokingly comes up behind Tina and grabs her around the mouth and pulls her away as she giggles. And in no way is that confusing for me as a male, because previously it seemed pretty cut and dry that Tina had no interest in Rod and simply put up with him, but now she's kind of acting like she's into him and finds it charming that he's a real piece of shit. Sorry, I'm starting to sound mad bitter right now. Nancy is very much not into the idea of staying at Tina's house while Tina and Rod are fooling around in a different room, but she does want to stay there to look out for Tina. And despite Glenn's advances, she turns him down and tells him that they are staying there for Tina, not so they can get their freak on as well. But if I were in Nancy and Glenn's shoes, I would get the impression that perhaps Tina doesn't need them that badly, and they might as well use this opportunity while they have a parentless house to stay at so they can aggressively hold each other's hands and hug or whatever else it is that teenagers do behind closed doors. Glenn is understandably frustrated and can't understand why Tina is so worked up over a nightmare, and I'm kind of with you there, Glenn. But Nancy defends her friend's honor and says that the guy in the dream was really scary, alright? So, of course, next thing we know, it cuts to Nancy and Glenn laying together in bed, and they're listening to Tina and Rod really go at it in another room. Seems like they must be playing a game of Twister or something. Glenn turns over and says the classic line, "Morality sucks." Then it cuts to the room where Tina and Rod are, and they're just wrapping up their no pants dance. And it would appear that just like that, Tina has completely changed her perception of Rod and is enamored with him. And it's not entirely clear, but I think the story is actually that they were a couple and were simply in the middle of a fight at the start of the movie. So, very confusing, but I guess it kind of clears it up a little bit. The two of them agree that they will no longer have any fights, which seems like a very sensible agreement to come to, and one that also won't be hard to just stick to. I mean, all you got to do is decide that that's what you want to do and do it, you know? And Rod says the two of them will no longer have nightmares, which freaks Tina the fuck out because she had this whole assumption that this was a much bigger thing going on than just her own random nightmare that felt very real. And Rod is insinuating that he also had a nightmare in addition to Nancy. But Rod assures her that guys have nightmares too and that women haven't cornered the market on bad dreams, and the two of them promptly go to sleep. Then, in a very confusing moment, it cuts to Nancy laying in bed, and we don't see Glenn beside her, and the crucifix that's hanging above her on the wall falls down and hits her in the face, which she has the mildest reaction to. She's just kind of seems a little confused and annoyed by the whole experience. But, like, did Glenn just go the fuck home? Or did we just not see him in the shot? I have no idea. Suddenly, Tina is awakened by the sound of a pebble hitting her window. So she gets out of bed, and Rod doesn't wake up to this. She looks at the window and sees that the pebble has cracked her window pretty severely, and she can hear the whispering voices saying her name like she did in the dream sequence in the beginning. And all of a sudden, Tina tries to get tough with this entity that she's dealing with, despite having been such a giant wuss about it thus far. As Tina looks outside, wondering who the creepy guy is that might be whispering to her, Nancy lays in bed, and we get a cool visual of Freddy pressing his hands and face through the back of the wall above the bed that Nancy is in. And it basically looks like the wall is made of some sort of elastic material. And Freddy just pushes himself through it a little bit and then back off. And the wall goes flat again. And Nancy seems like she realizes something just happened above her, but isn't really sure what. She holds the crucifix in her hands and then turns around and knocks on the wall behind her to feel that it is solid and that she must have just been imagining whatever it was that just happened. In what has to be the smartest move ever, Tina elects to go downstairs to investigate the voice that is whispering to her, and in no way does it seem like this might be a bad idea as she's strolling outside in just a button down shirt and I guess panties with no other clothing to speak of, including being barefoot. She slowly paces outside as she keeps hearing the voice. Tina looks over and sees Freddy's shadow against the side of a building, and he appears in her view, but his face is still too dark to see. But his arms appear to be at least 3 times longer than they should be, and he keeps taunting Tina and laughing at her very creepily. Tina turns and runs away, and Freddy chases after her, and then suddenly, defying the laws of logic and physics, Freddy appears on the other side of her and stops her where she's running. But for some reason, she's able to run away uninhibited, despite this being a great time for Freddy to grab a hold of her and fucking murder her. Then, as he trails behind her, he taunts her by holding up his gloveless hand and using the finger knives to chop off his ring and pinky fingers. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, this effect is pretty disappointing because it's too dark to really be able to see, but you can tell that the blood is spattering from his severed fingers and it's not squirting out enough. Like it's barely squirting out of one of the fingers. Hina makes her way back to the back door of her house where she originally came out, and Freddy catches her and begins to grab her and wrestle with her. And suddenly it seems like she's fighting with Freddy under the covers back in her room in her bed, and it wakes up Rod, who gets out of bed to investigate and finds that Tina is under the covers by herself, having a giant shit fit with seemingly no one. Rod aggressively rips the covers off of Tina, who is just laying in bed thrashing around, and suddenly 4 slash marks appear just under her stomach as she lays there bleeding. And then suddenly she's supernaturally lifted off of the bed, tossed on the floor, dragged up the wall, and held against the ceiling by some unseen force. Rod just stands there watching and is powerless to help her, so he just repeatedly shouts out her name like that's doing fucking anything, and the commotion wakes Nancy up in the other room. I'm not sure if I missed something, or maybe there was a deleted scene and they thought that we wouldn't notice, but Glenn is nowhere to be seen in this sequence, and it's not clear if he went home or what happened to him at this point. As Nancy rushes over to Tina's bedroom, Tina is thrown back to the floor, covered in blood, and Rod is angrily yelling out, asking who did this, as if someone's just going to answer him in this moment. And then suddenly, as Nancy is trying to get in the room, Glenn just fucking reappears out of nowhere with no explanation and startles Nancy. And I'm hoping that they explain that he was downstairs getting a snack or some shit. Because realistically, with the amount of time he's been gone, that would kind of work. When Nancy and Glenn finally get inside the room, I am deeply confused by Nancy's reaction because she kind of looks around and doesn't say anything at all. And it's almost like he's like smiling in satisfaction that she knew something crazy was going on and she's like happy about it. And it's like she's happier that she was right about that than she is horrified by whatever the fuck just happened to her friend. It cuts to what I guess are a couple of detectives at police headquarters walking inside the building, explaining who Tina is, and they're discussing the incident that happened at her house. One explains that Tina's father abandoned her and her mother 10 years before, and they mentioned that Tina's mother was not only supposed to be gone for 2 nights, but she's actually, in fact, in Vegas with her boyfriend. They established that it's pretty clear Tina was killed with a weapon, but no weapon was actually found at the scene. They discuss how Rod has been on their radar for having been caught with drugs, having been caught brawling, and other things like that, which seems pretty on brand for a guy like Rod, if I'm being completely honest. One of them explains that the victim's friend Nancy is in the other man's office waiting, and it turns out that this man is actually Lieutenant Donald Thompson, who also happens to be Nancy's father, and he's furious as he walks into his office and sees her and begins berating her mother and his ex wife, Marge, for allowing Nancy to stay at Tina's house with no parental supervision. It's pretty clear that Marge and Donald have been divorced for some time, and they have a less than civil dynamic now that they're apart. Donald criticizes Nancy for being at the house with the 3 other kids, especially when one of the 3 other kids was Rod Lane, who he describes as a lunatic. And Nancy responds to him by saying that Rod is not a lunatic, Daddy, even though everything we have seen of Rod thus far would lead me to believe that he is probably as bad as Donald thinks he is, even if he didn't actually kill Tina. He's still got a lot of shit on his rap sheet, you know what I mean? And I don't honestly know why Nancy would be defending Rod other than to defend herself for her own stupid actions while she's in denial about how stupid they are. It's pretty clear that Rod and virtually everyone else other than Nancy truly believes that Rod perpetrated everything that happened to Tina. Marge explains that Rod has a reputation for being insanely jealous and that she'd heard that Tina and him had a fight, but Nancy claims it wasn't actually that serious. And then Marge responds to that comment by Nancy by saying that perhaps Nancy doesn't think murder is that serious, which is just the kind of annoying horse shit that parents in these movies like to say to demonstrate that they're not actually comprehending what their kids are saying or even really listening, and they are in fact just hearing everything as they want to hear it. But it's pretty clear Nancy is very upset about Tina's death as they were very close friends, and of course, she's upset that her mother is insinuating otherwise and just says she meant that their fights weren't that serious. And it's like, yeah, everyone other than fucking Marge realized that. Nancy goes on to explain to Donald and Marge that Tina had had a nightmare the previous night where someone was trying to kill her, and she explains to them that because she was so scared by this nightmare that she simply did not want to sleep alone while her mother was out of town, and the screen just fades to black as Nancy tearfully weeps over the fate of her friend. The next morning, Marge is in the kitchen and has her shitty little TV on, and she's watching a news report about Tina's death, and it explains that there's a manhunt going on, of which Rod Lane is the subject. I don't know if that was the best way for me to phrase that, but it's what I'm going with. Nancy quietly walks in the kitchen and listens to the news report, but as Marge notices her entering the room, she quickly turns off the TV and doesn't even acknowledge it, even though it probably would have been nice if Marge would have said that she was sorry because she knew that this was a possibility that Nancy would walk into the fucking room and see this and be upset by it. But she doesn't apologize or anything, really. And as Nancy goes for the door to leave, Marge asks her where she's going, like she doesn't fucking know where her teenage daughter would be going on a weekday in the morning. Nancy explains that she is going to school, and Marge tells her that she could hear her tossing and turning the night before and that she has no business going to school. But Nancy insists that she has to go to school. Otherwise, she'll just sit up in her room and go crazy thinking about everything that has happened, which is actually a pretty valid point. And also, what if Marge approached this as, honey, I really don't want you to go to school? Like, she kind of has to tell her that she doesn't want her going to school. As a kid, I would have not gone to school every time I had the chance if it was my call. So, for the mom in this situation to not realize that she needs to be the one that establishes that and can't act like her daughter is a psycho for just doing that is insane. Marge asks Nancy if she even slept at all the night before, and Nancy replies by saying that she'll sleep in study hall and that she'd honestly just rather keep busy. Marge makes her promise she'll return right home after school, and Nancy heads for class. As Nancy walks down the sidewalk towards school, she looks across the street and behind her, and she sees a man in aviator sunglasses and a navy blue business suit standing there watching her. And honestly, she should know something is up because on top of that, there's some pretty spooky and suspenseful music playing as well. You can't ignore that. After she sees the man, she faces forward again for a moment and walks a little bit farther. And when she turns around to look at him again, he's gone. Suddenly, a man who is obviously Rod puts his hand around Nancy's mouth and pulls her off the sidewalk and into a bunch of trees and bushes. Rod tells her that he is convinced that they're going to kill him if they catch him, and Nancy unconvincingly tells him that that's not true. Rod explains that he didn't do shit to Tina and that there was seemingly someone else in the room with them. Nancy points out that the door was locked from the inside, and she doesn't really seem to believe that it could be possible that there was someone else in there with them. And Rod pleads with her that he's telling the truth and that he's annoyed that she's giving him the third degree about it, even though it's like, dude, what do you think people will think happened? Suddenly, Donald appears in uniform with his revolver drawn behind the two of them, and he tells Rod to step away from Nancy. And of course, Rod does the smart thing and promptly runs away. As Donald repositions himself to aim at the fleeing delinquent, Nancy shuffles over in front of his view to prevent him from shooting Rod, I guess, which is a risky move to make for a thug like Rod Lane. But as Rod runs down the road in broad daylight, several police cruisers surround him and an officer wrestles him to the ground and immediately finds his switchblade in his pocket. Rod, of course, pleads that he didn't do anything, and Donald's like, "Book 'em, Lou." Donald looks back at Nancy and she angrily accuses him of using her, and then Donald does the honorable thing by blaming her for deciding to go to school that day at all, and she just storms off as he shouts her name and she ignores him. Cuts to Nancy in class, and her teacher is walking around the room carrying on about Shakespeare. And of course, at this point, Nancy has gotten no sleep and she's pretty tired and she's just trying to stay awake at her desk and not, enter into a nightmarish hellscape where she can't tell what's real and what's not. In a very short span of time, as some random guy that looks like Cincinnati Bengals quarterback Joe Burrow is reading aloud in front of the class, Nancy looks over and sees Tina in a clear body bag in the hall calling out her name. The body bag is covered in blood on the inside, and Tina is just standing inside it, reaching out to Nancy. Honestly, this sequence is probably the most well done of the movie. It's just one of those scenes that I remembered very well a long time after I first saw it. Nancy looks up and notices that the guy who's reading in front of the class is starting to whisper weird demonic phrases instead of reading from his book. Then Nancy turns back to the hallway where Tina was in the body bag, and she sees that Tina is gone and there is only a puddle of blood left on the floor. Nancy gets up from her desk to walk over into the hallway, and when she looks down the hall, she can see Tina laying in the body bag, and suddenly Tina's legs lift up as she's dragged out of sight, and there is a trail of blood following her. As Nancy rounds the corner to go after Tina in the body bag, she runs into a hall monitor who chastises her for not having a pass. Oddly enough, this hall monitor is a girl, and she's wearing a horizontal green and red striped sweater that looks much like a cleaner version of what Freddy's been wearing, but I'm sure that that's just a coincidence. But when Nancy gets past the hall monitor, the girl now has Freddy's voice and is wearing a knife glove and taunts her a bit, but Nancy just keeps going. Who could have seen that coming? Nancy makes her way down to the basement, following the trail of blood from Tina's body bag. As she looks around, she sees what is pretty clearly something very similar to what Tina was seeing in the opening sequence, and it appears that a fire is the only thing that is illuminating this basement. Freddy steps around the corner and is shrouded in darkness momentarily, and Nancy asks him who he is. You can kind of see his face as he holds an evil smile and lifts up his shirt and uses his knives to cut open a section of his skin, and a bunch of gross green stuff comes leaking out. There's like worms or maggots or something in there, and he puts his shirt back down, and that's just going to get infected, Freddy. Freddy corners Nancy after he chases after her for a bit, and she stands helpless at the end of the hall as he approaches her. She keeps yelling out to him that he's not real and that this is only a dream, but it's not snapping her out of it. She takes her forearm and presses it against the hot pipe next to her, which burns her arm and jostles her awake, and she wakes up back in class screaming like a fucking lunatic. The entire class looks back at her, and the teacher attempts to console her, but Nancy's not really having fucking any of it. And she just insists on going home for the day. And as Nancy walks outside, she looks down at her arm and sees that she still has a burn mark on it from the pipe in her dream. So she realizes that things are happening in her dreams and they're carrying over into real life somehow. She goes to see Rod in jail, and he's telling her the story about what happened the night Tina was killed and how there was clearly somebody else in there with them that Rod couldn't see. Nancy frustratedly asked him how that could be, and Rod says he doesn't know and that he doesn't expect her to believe him. Rod explains to her that he could just see things happening to Tina, but he couldn't see who was doing it, and he could just see what was happening on her skin, like four blades were cutting her all at once. Rod goes on to explain that he believed that he was simply having another nightmare, like he had the night before, that featured a man who had knives for fingers. So clearly, Rod was also dreaming about Freddy Krueger, and you can really see Nancy trying to process what Rod has told her, and it really freaks her the fuck out. And Rod asks her if she thinks that he did it, and she says no, kind of unconvincingly. Then she pounds on the door to have the guard let her back out of the jail cell. At Nancy's house that night, she is taking a bath and saying the chants that the little girls playing jump rope are saying, like 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, whatever. And she slowly dozes off, and we see Freddy's hand reaching up from between her legs threateningly, waiting to strike. Luckily, Marge wakes her up by knocking on the door, and the hand disappears from between her legs back into the water. Through the door, Marge reminds her not to fall asleep while in the bath because she could drown in there, and Nancy acts annoyed and dismisses the very notion of this, even though she literally just fell asleep in the bath. Almost immediately after Marge walks away, Nancy dozes off again, and it seems like Freddy just pulls her under the water, but the bath is not just the depth of a normal bathtub, but appears to be endlessly deep, and she keeps getting pulled under farther and farther as she struggles. Marge can hear her screaming and commotion coming from inside the bathroom, and she rushes to go get the key for the door. And somehow, I guess Nancy manages to wake up and get out of the bath and put on a towel. And then when Marge gets inside, Nancy is very confusingly dismissive again and just says that she's fine and that she just slipped as she was getting out of the tub. As Nancy gets into bed, Glenn comes to her window and she lets him inside, and they talk about how Nancy hasn't slept and that she freaked out in English class. And he notices the burn on her arm. Nancy looks into a mirror at her sleep deprived physical appearance and remarks in terror that she looks like she's 20 years old, which apparently to her means elderly and grotesque, of course. She asks Glenn if he had any dreams or nightmares the night before, and he says no, and that he slept like a rock. And she asks him if he believes in the boogeyman or in people dreaming about things that are going to happen, and Glenn just simply says no to both of those ideas. Glenn asserts that Rod killed Tina like it's a fact, and that Nancy surely knows that. Nancy explains to him that she needs him to stand guard while she goes to look for someone, but as she begins to elaborate on her plan, the screen fades to black and we don't get to hear what she's going to do specifically. Next thing you know, Nancy is walking out of the front door of her house in her PJs, and the music is getting spooky again. As she walks out into the night, she looks back to confirm that Glenn is still standing guard, and he pops out from behind a tree and confirms that he indeed is still standing guard. So she just keeps walking and approaches the jailhouse and looks into Rod's cell and sees Freddy opening the door and coming inside and approaching Rod's cell. When Nancy sees him, she begins calling out for Glenn, but Glenn is not responding and she keeps screaming out his name repeatedly as Freddy tauntingly approaches Rod, sleeping in the bed in his cell. But then it seems like Freddy disappears and Nancy looks over and she can see Tina calling out her name, and a gross bug crawls out from Tina's mouth. Nancy begins to back away from undead Tina and continues calling out Glenn's name, hoping to get his attention. And then Freddy reaches out and grabs her and she flees from him. She runs back to her house and goes in the front door with Freddy chasing after her. And she climbs up her stairs, and the stairs are seemingly made of something like pancake batter or marshmallow fluff or something, and they're like collapsing as she makes each step. Freddy begins breaking in the front door behind her as she anxiously attempts to make her way up the stairs. She finally gets upstairs to her bedroom and opens the door to find Glenn sleeping in the chair, and she repeatedly tells herself that it's just a dream and that it isn't real. Then Freddy comes crashing through the door and tackles her as the two of them thrash across the room, and Nancy attempts to defend herself with a pillow that Freddy quickly cuts through and sends feathers flying everywhere. And I gotta say, Freddy Krueger has to be the biggest fucking weakling if he is not handling this stupid ass teenage girl. And suddenly, Nancy wakes up and is in bed, and Glenn wakes up in the chair next to her, and she yells at him for not doing his one job, which was to not fall asleep and to wake her up if it seemed like she was having a bad dream. Suddenly, Marge begins pounding on the door, and Nancy has Glenn hide back outside on the trellis, and she explains to her mom that the commotion was nothing. It was just a little dream, even though she was screaming bloody fucking murder. After Marge closes the door, Nancy has a realization and takes Glenn with her to go to the jailhouse to check on Rod because she senses that he could still be in danger because it seems like stuff that's happening in dreams are happening in real life too. As Nancy argues with the night guard and subsequently her father about just checking on Rod to make sure he's okay, they really put up a big fight with her and it's fucking annoying. It keeps cutting back and forth between that conversation and the sheets on Rod's bed, seemingly attempting to strangle him in his sleep. Nancy knows something could be horribly wrong, and she pleads with her dad to just go down and check on him. And Donald can see in her eyes that she's genuinely concerned and has reason to believe something might actually be happening to Rod. Suddenly, we see the sheet wrap around Rod's neck, and begin pulling him out of the bed and up out of the window near the ceiling. Before they can all get down to his cell, the sheet has already strangled and killed Rod and left him hanging from the window. It cuts to Rod's funeral, and the guy performing the service is being pretty heavy handed about how Rod lived by the sword and died by the sword. Nancy stops Donald after the service and tells him that the person who killed Rod and Tina is still out there, but that she doesn't know who he is. And all she can do is tell him that the man who is doing this is very severely burned with a dirty red and green sweater and knives that he uses like fingernails. As Nancy is getting in the car, Donald tells Marge to let Nancy recover from the shock of everything that she's experienced over the last few days. But Marge decides that she wants to take Nancy in for a sleep study, so she does, and they have her hooked up to wires and probes. The doctor and Marge watch Nancy while she's hooked up to the machine and is beginning to fall asleep, and the doctor doesn't think anything seems to be amiss about her situation as of yet. As Nancy goes into deep sleep, he says that her heart rate appears to be a little elevated. Suddenly, all of her numbers begin to spike, and the doctor can't understand what's going on. And Nancy is convulsing and shaking in her bed and begins screaming. Nancy thrashes awake, and Marge and the doctor rush in to console her. But when they go to give her an injection of something to help her fall asleep, she freaks out because obviously she doesn't fucking want to go to sleep. Nancy pulls out Freddy's fedora and she realizes that she somehow took it from inside her dream and brought it into real life. As Marge holds the fedora, she looks at it and you just know that she's been hiding something and you're just dying to know what horrific nonsense she's been keeping a secret this whole time. On what I guess is the next morning, Nancy comes downstairs and can hear Marge having a telephone conversation with somebody about the fedora, and Marge is carrying on about how she doesn't have any idea where Nancy actually got it. But Marge hangs up the phone when she notices Nancy has come downstairs, and she does by far the worst job of pretending not to have been up to something possible. Marge, of course, suggests that Nancy must have gotten the hat from somewhere that was not her dream, even though it really can't be explained how she would have kept it hidden for the whole sleep study until that moment. Nancy explains to Marge that Rod did not kill Tina and that Rod also did not hang himself in his jail cell. Nancy points out that the hat has the name Fred Krueger inside of it for some reason, which is very convenient. Because, I mean, not to be a prick about it, but usually people don't write their names in their hats as a rule that I know of. And it is getting increasingly painfully obvious that Marge is hiding something that she is refusing to share with Nancy at this time, even though it's pretty clear that she needs to tell Nancy whatever the fuck it is and get it off her chest. She finally relents and says to Nancy that Fred Krueger can't possibly be after her because he's dead, thus revealing that she knows who Fred Krueger is and has all along, which of course pisses Nancy off because every time she's mentioned this whole thing, Marge has acted like she has no idea what she's talking about. In her anger, Nancy makes a snide comment about how she could just stay home with her mom and get loaded like her mom always does to take the edge off, and Marge slaps her across the face. Later on, Nancy and Glenn are walking around and they cross this super romantic bridge, and Glenn is telling her about what other cultures do about their dreams, and Glenn catches her looking through a book about booby traps. And it's strange because I feel like if not for the circumstances, I would have absolutely roasted anybody pretty bad for actually having a book like this because it seems so silly that it could even exist as a real book. It seems like something from a fucking cartoon. Nancy's behavior has crossed into concerning territory, and Glenn is more worried that she's going too far with these things that have been going on. Nancy arrives home and looks around the house outside and notices that someone has installed bars on all of the windows, which is confusing because I don't know that the number of windows they have on their house would allow for anyone to just install those bars in what I assume was a fairly short amount of time that Nancy had been gone, let alone if they actually had to plan that as well and they hadn't premeditated the idea of the bars in such a short span of time. Like, it seems like they would have needed a lot more time, it would have made more sense if Nancy came home and the mom was still installing the bars, but boom, they're just fucking there. Nancy comes inside and calls out her mother, who immediately appears at the end of the hallway. And Nancy is clearly pissed about the bars, but Marge says it's for security. Nancy says, security from what? And Marge is like, not from what, but from whom? And then she tells Nancy to come downstairs to the basement with her and she'll tell her who she's talking about. When they get down there, Nancy explains that Fred Krueger was a filthy child murderer who killed at least 20 kids, and they were all kids from the town. She goes on to explain that it was terrifying when they couldn't figure out who it was that was doing this, and that it was worse when they actually caught the guy. She says that a search warrant didn't get signed in the right place, and just like that, after they had apprehended Krueger, he was set free on a technicality. Then a bunch of the parents in the town tracked Krueger down at an old abandoned boiler room where he used to take the kids that he was going to kill. She explains that they doused Krueger in gasoline and burned him alive. And Marge reiterates that he can't get Nancy because he's dead, because Marge killed him. And she even shows Nancy that she has his knife glove that for some reason she's been storing as a keepsake in her basement. Don't really understand that super well. That night, Nancy calls Glenn and explains to him that she knows who the killer is and she wants Glenn to help her kill him when she brings him out of her dream like she did the fedora. Of course, Glenn is still fairly skeptical about the whole thing and isn't taking her entirely serious. She makes Glenn swear he won't fall asleep and they agree to meet at midnight. And this is when she intends to have Glenn wake her up in the middle of her having a nightmare and allow for her to bring Freddy out into real life. And so naturally, the first thing Glenn does after he hangs up the phone call with Nancy, where he promised he wouldn't fall asleep, is what any person who is trying to avoid falling asleep would do, which is putting on a pair of headphones and sitting down and getting cozy on his bed. Nancy does a little bit of soul searching by looking at a picture on her desk and popping a caffeine pill and washing it down with some coffee. Glenn's mother knocks on his bedroom door and walks in to find him sleeping with his headphones on and the TV playing. She explains to him that it's almost midnight and that he needs to go to bed, even though I do find that a bit confusing because she elected to wake him up for no reason when she found him, so she could tell him that he needed to go back to sleep, basically. Marge tucks Nancy into bed and leaves her to sleep, but of course, Nancy hops right out of bed as soon as Marge leaves and begins hatching her scheme to catch Freddy. Glenn's parents are hanging out outside their house, looking over at Nancy's house, and the dad is talking about how he thinks Nancy is clearly a legitimate lunatic and he doesn't want their son hanging around her anymore. And it comically cuts from the two of them talking about what a nut job Nancy and Marge are to Nancy gearing up and looking at the bandages on her arm. She opens her door briefly to see her mother outside, and this whole thing just cracks me up with her mother being an alcoholic, supposedly, because it's the most cliche version of alcoholism that you only really see in movies or TV shows that are not very well made, where the mother is drinking liquor directly from a bottle and she's not doing it discreetly in any way. And I feel like it's a thing that addicts do to hide their addictions. You know, they don't do these things out in the open where everyone can see. And she's also doing it in a hallway where she knows she could get caught doing it. So it seems even more nuts. Not that alcoholism is funny because they say alcoholism is a disease, but like Mitch Hedberg said, alcoholism may be a disease, but it's the only disease you can get yelled at for having. Nancy closes the door back to leave her mother to her bottle, and she finally calls Glenn, who is, much to everyone's surprise, laying in his bed sleeping with his headphones on, and the phone is just ringing next to him. Glenn's mother picks up the downstairs phone and Nancy asks for Glenn, and Glenn's father walks up and the mom tells him that it's Nancy. He tells her to ask Nancy why she's calling, and Nancy says that it's private, but it's very important. And the dad intervenes and grabs the phone from the mom and tells Nancy that Glenn is asleep and that he'll have to talk to her tomorrow, which is parent equivalent of telling her to fuck off. Then the dad also proceeds to deliberately leave the phone off the hook after this, so that if Nancy calls again in the middle of the night, the call won't go through, it won't ring or anything, and Nancy will only get a busy signal on her end. When Nancy tries Glenn's house again and can't get through, she hangs it up and then the phone starts ringing. And when she answers it, there's just a screeching noise. And in her hasty reaction to being taunted by Kruger with the screeching noise through the telephone, she jerks the phone and breaks the wire, thus rendering her bedroom phone completely useless if Glenn were to try and call her at some point. Nancy proceeds to open the door to her bedroom to check outside, and her mom is no longer out there. And as she goes to walk out of her bedroom, she hears the disconnected phone ringing, and she turns to look at the phone on her bed that shouldn't be functioning, and she just has this horrified look on her face. She apprehensively paces toward the ringing phone on her bed, and when she answers it, she puts it up to her ear and hears Fred's voice say that he's her boyfriend now. And in this startling use of special effects, somehow Freddy's tongue comes out of the mouthpiece of the phone like it's trying to lick Nancy's face, and she throws the phone down in disgust. Nancy realizes that this must mean Glenn is in danger, so she rushes downstairs to go to his house, but the door is locked and the deadbolt requires a key to open even from the inside. Marge tauntingly tells Nancy that she locked it all up so that Nancy couldn't escape, and she refuses to give her the key. It cuts to Glenn laying asleep in bed with his headphones on and a TV on his lap, which has to be really uncomfortable because that TV is probably not particularly light. Suddenly, Freddy's arm reaches up through the bed and grabs Glenn at the waist and begins pulling him down into what is becoming a giant hole in the bed. Once Glenn and a few of his belongings are pulled inside the bed in this hole, all that's visible is the hole that is left in the bed, and suddenly a geyser of blood begins spraying out of the hole and onto Glenn's ceiling and fucking everywhere. Then Glenn's mother opens the door and sees what's going on in the bedroom and begins shrieking in horror at the scene. An ambulance arrives at Glenn's house, along with law enforcement, including Donald, who realizes what house it is. He looks over to see a super bummed out Nancy watching from her window, and he just kind of waves over at her. Donald walks into Glenn's house and can see a huge blood stain on the ceiling of their living room that is coming from the upstairs where Glenn was killed. Nancy calls and tells Donald that she knows what happened to Glenn and who did it, and that she has a proposition for Donald, even though it's more of a request, because a proposition, in my experience, usually is a give and take, mutually beneficial thing for both sides. Anywho, she wants him to come to her house in exactly 20 minutes so he can arrest Fred Krueger when she brings him out of her dream. Of course, Donald isn't taking her particularly seriously and has a job to do, but she keeps making him promise that he'll come in exactly 20 minutes and break down her door. When he hangs up, it does that annoying movie thing that never actually happens in real life, which is that while she still has the phone off the hook and he's hung up on her, it goes to dial tone, because in reality, all that happens when you hang up on somebody on their end on a landline is they hear dead air and no dial tone. And if they leave the phone off the hook long enough, they might get some kind of error message from the operator. But as far as I know, it never goes to dial tone until you hang up the phone, leave it on the hook for a few seconds, and then take it off again. Donald gets one of the officers to keep an eye on Nancy's house while he tries to investigate Glenn's murder upstairs. So Nancy gets to work setting up a bunch of fucking booby traps. And of course, it's a bit like Home Alone, where she's setting up all of these traps, but you're not exactly sure how the traps will really work when someone is caught by them, which is a great way to add some suspense. She's doing something with a light bulb, she's setting up a tripwire, and she's emptying shotgun shells of their gunpowder and seemingly putting them into the light bulb. She's rigging a sledgehammer above her door. And like I said, we don't really know how it's going to play out or what she's imagining will happen. Nancy is talking to her mother, Marge, who is laying in bed, and Marge is expressing regret over having not told Nancy sooner about the monster Fred Krueger. And one note I would like to make, because the liquor bottle makes another appearance here with Marge, and it's that Marge has not once throughout the course of this entire movie seemed like she was ever actually drunk or really even buzzed, which is actually good because generally, especially with the caliber of this script and the actors in this movie, it's often painful to see someone pretend to be drunk. And I'm to understand that Ronnie Blakely is actually a pretty good actress. And so, even in that circumstance, I don't really want to see her pretend to be drunk. But she seems at best like she's just chronically hungover in this movie and bizarre, but like she's not actually ever intoxicated at all. Nancy finally quits fucking around and gets into bed so she can fall asleep and capture Freddy. She sets a timer on her watch for 10 minutes so it will wake her up when she needs to. Then she promptly lays down to go to bed. Next thing we know, she's walking down the stairs of her house and heads for the basement where her mother had previously told her about Freddy. She realizes that Freddy's knife glove that Marge had been keeping as a memento for some reason is no longer there, and she somehow manages to find yet another basement, seemingly leading down from that one. I'm just going to preface this real quick. This is all a dream sequence, obviously, especially this late in the movie. You don't forget that dreams are starting to happen. As soon as anything is going on, it kind of processes in your mind. As she descends those stairs, the music is getting extra spooky, and she can hear Freddy repeatedly laughing, kind of off in the distance. She finds a spiral staircase and goes down that, and then proceeds to take a fucking ladder down even farther into what appears to be a boiler room, but she still hasn't actually seen jack shit. It's like she's going down all of these stairs and ladders and things, and it just seems like there's like 7 layers to this basement in her dream. She calls out to Fred to announce that she's there, and she continues looking around in this weird boiler room area. Nancy looks at a bed down there and sees something laying under the blanket on top of it, and realizes it appears to be the same crucifix that hit her in the head toward the beginning of the movie. Keep seeing Freddy's knived glove ripping around various things that are near Nancy, but he always seems to pull his hand away before she actually notices him. She cries out, pleading with Freddy to show himself, and he appears standing right next to her. When she runs away from him, she heads down another spiral staircase and jumps off of it before she goes all the way down it. But suddenly, the basement area that she was in transforms into the outside of her house. And I want everyone to keep in mind that this is supposed to be a dream, so all of this stuff deliberately makes almost no logical sense whatsoever. Nancy lands in the bushes outside of her house and she looks down at her watch, and a voice from the watch announces that she only has 10 seconds left on her timer, and she's looking for Freddy, and he reveals himself finally. So she goes over and tackles him and tries to hold on to him so that she can wake up and make him come out into the real world with her. But her timer goes off and she wakes up alone in bed and can't see Fred anywhere. So she thinks that she might have failed to bring him into the real world. And just as she sits up in bed and resigns herself to believing that she's just completely fucking nuts, we get a big jump scare as Freddy appears and jumps up from the other side of the bed, opposite Nancy. She gets the upper hand on him long enough to flee out of her bedroom and into the hall, and she closes the door behind her. And I don't know if I either missed this or if it was not very well established, but it appears that Nancy reversed the lock on the door to her room, and it gives her enough time while Freddy's fumbling with it to rig up a string for that sledgehammer that's hanging above her door. While Freddy is still struggling to get out of the room, Nancy opens a window and screams across the street, trying to get the attention of the police and, more importantly, her dad, so they'll come over and apprehend Freddy. She even breaks open the tiny window at the top of her front door that she couldn't get out of before and starts pleading with the police to come over there. Freddy finally breaks through her bedroom door only to be almost immediately struck with a sledgehammer. It swings down and hits him in the stomach just like Nancy intended. Then, for some reason, he immediately falls over the railing and down to the first floor. He thinks that he has Nancy cornered in the living room, but he runs through the tripwire, which triggers the lamp with a light bulb full of gunpowder to explode behind him. And I mean, this gunpowder light bulb really seemed to startle Freddy pretty good and was probably totally worth setting up. I would probably liken it to that cellophane S from Superman 2 and its level of effectiveness in slowing the bad guy down. Nancy runs downstairs into the basement and Freddy pursues her, and she manages to corner him and douse him in gasoline and set him on fire. Freddy makes some pretty gruesome growling and groaning noises as he's on fire and stumbling around, and he manages to get to the top of the stairs before falling back down them and collapsing on the floor of the basement. Despite having had several chances to come to Nancy's rescue, the police finally decide it's about time that they go and check out what's going on at her house with all this commotion. The police take their sweet time breaking down the front door and come inside, and Nancy tries to lead them to the basement where Freddy was laying on fire, but she looks around and sees that she can see where Freddy clearly left the basement and walked across the first floor on the carpet because each footprint is on fire on the carpet. Trail of footsteps leads all the way up to the second floor, and Nancy realizes he must have gone for Marge. And when she goes into Marge's room, she finds Freddy still covered in flames and basically crouched on top of Marge on the bed. Donald runs in and puts a blanket over Freddy to put him out. And when he pulls it away, there seems to be only one very charred corpse, and the bed has come open underneath, and there's a bunch of dry ice fog looking stuff, and the body is slowly lowering into it. Nancy asks Donald if he now believes her, and Donald just hugs her sadly, which, to be clear, is not an apology and not an admission of wrongdoing. Now, one fun thing for me when I see special effects, especially in older movies like this, is to try and guess how they might have accomplished the special effect given that it's pre CGI. And I want to say the most likely possibility for how they did this effect in my mind with the bed is if they covered the bed with a green screen or a blue screen and then use that to project the image of the charred body lowering into it. That would just be my best guess. I suppose they could have also used a video projector from the ceiling and projected that image onto it, but I was actually pretty impressed with the effect. It didn't look super wonky or anything. For some reason, they leave Nancy in her mother's room by herself where all this just happened. Like, they would not fucking do that. And Nancy looks at the bed for a minute, and as she looks away and goes to the door, it seems like Freddy is coming up out of the bed and it's stretching like that elastic wall did early on in the movie. But honestly, it seems like Nancy has had more than enough of Freddy's shit for one day. And she just says, I know you're there, Freddy. And she doesn't even turn around initially. As he cuts open the bed sheet, Freddy threatens to kill her, but Nancy doubles down and seemingly has a startling revelation as she asserts that he is not real and that all of this has been a dream. She tells him that she takes back every ounce of energy she gave him and that she wants her friends and family back. Then, as she turns to walk out the door of Marge's room, Freddy makes one last effort to attack her, but he vanishes midway through it and seems like he's vanquished to another dimension or something. Then, as Nancy opens the door, she walks out into the daylight of a different day, and it's actually the front door of her house. As she steps outside, Marge appears behind her and makes the assertion that she's going to stop drinking because she just doesn't feel like it anymore. And let me tell you, I've never been an alcoholic, but I am positive it is just that easy to give it all up. Glenn pulls up in his red convertible with Tina and Rod in the back seat, and Nancy hops inside the car in the passenger seat with them, presumably to head off to school. Then, just as you think everything is going to be just fine, the ragtop of the convertible suddenly closes over them, and they don't initially have a big reaction to it. But looking from the outside, you can see that the top has the same red and green pattern as Freddy's sweater, and the mechanisms for the top begin closing on their own and locking inside the vehicle, and the kids start to get more alarmed. all of the windows start closing by themselves, and the kids really start to freak the fuck out because they can't make any of it stop and they can't escape the car. Despite the terror of the children being very evident, Marge continues smiling and waving at them like nothing is amiss at all. The car just begins driving away by itself, and Marge watches it happily as she stands in front of the front door of the house. Suddenly, what is clearly Freddy's arm breaks through the front door window and grabs Marge and pulls her through into the house through this tiny little window as Marge screams. And this whole sequence feels exceptionally weird, even by the standards of this movie. And it slowly fades to black as you can see the kids playing jump rope. And they're doing their chant of 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. 7, 8, gonna stay up late. 9, 10, never sleep again. And that continues on as we roll credits. And I've got to say, that is the weirdest rug pull of an ending I've probably ever seen in a movie. And it feels a little tacked on and cheap, but more on that a little bit later. Okay, so trivia for this movie. New Line Cinema was saved from bankruptcy by the success of the film and was jokingly nicknamed the house that Freddy built. Wes Craven first came up with the basic idea for the movie from a series of articles in the Los Angeles Times over a 3-year period about a group of Southeast Asian refugees from the Hmong tribe, several of whom died in the throes of horrific nightmares. The group had come to the US to escape the murderous reign of Pol Pot, and within a year of arriving, 3 men had died, all in similar situations. The young, otherwise healthy man would have a nightmare, then refuse to sleep for as long as he could. When he finally fell asleep from exhaustion, he awoke screaming, then died. Autopsy results revealed that they had not died from heart failure, but had simply died. It was this inability to find a cause of death that intrigued Craven so much. Medical authorities have since called the phenomenon Asian death syndrome, a variant of sudden unexpected death syndrome, and Brugada syndrome. In the original script, Freddy was a child molester. However, the decision was made to change him into being a child murderer to avoid accusations of exploiting a series of child molestations in California around the time of production. He was rewritten as a child molester in the 2010 remake starring Jackie Earle Haley. The film cost roughly $1.8 million to produce, of which only $57,000 was reserved for the ambitious special effects. Effects designer Jim Doyle accepted anyway because he was desperate for work. The movie made its entire budget back in its opening weekend, and the reason I said it at the beginning was this is debated because I saw this that says 1.8, but the official numbers said 1.1 on like IMDb and stuff. All of the boiler room footage in the film was shot in the basement of the Lincoln Heights jail in Los Angeles, which was condemned shortly after production wrapped due to high levels of asbestos. Wes Craven's original concept for Freddy Krueger was considerably more gruesome, with teeth showing through the flesh over his jaw, pus running from the sores, and a part of the skull showing through the head. Makeup artist David B. Miller argued that an actor couldn't be convincingly made up that way, and a puppet would be hard to film and wouldn't blend well with live actors, so these ideas were eventually abandoned. The inspiration for the character of Freddy came from several sources in Wes Craven's childhood. Fred Krueger was a schoolmate of his, with whom he had shared a paper route and who had bullied him for several years. Freddy's burns came from a man with severe burn scars by whom Craven had once been terrified as a child, and Freddy's attire, especially the dirty clothes and hat, was inspired by an alcoholic hobo that Craven saw staring at him through the window of his house one day when he was 10 years old. Wow. The original glove was later used in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, and was also seen hanging on the wall of the work shed in Evil Dead 2 from 1987. This was in response to the use of the Evil Dead on a television screen in the film, and part of a continued banter between directors Wes Craven and Sam Raimi. However, when Wes Craven loaned the glove to the A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors set, it got lost, and it is rumored to be in the possession of Robert Englund's agent. The scene where Freddy's arms elongate was achieved by having men with fishing poles on each side of the alley operating a set of puppet arms attached to Robert Englund. It would take about 3 hours to get Robert Englund into his Freddy makeup. The shots of Freddy's hands building the bladed glove in the opening scene are played by special effects man Charles Ballardinelli, as Ballardinelli was the only one who knew exactly how to cut the glove and insert the blades. The sparking glove effect seen throughout the movie was achieved by attaching the glove to a car battery. The famous scraping noise was created by scratching a steak knife on the underside of a metal chair. The idea behind the glove was a practical one on Wes Craven's part, as he wanted to give the character a unique weapon, but also something that could be made cheaply and wouldn't be difficult to use or transport. At the time, he was studying primal fears embedded in the subconscious of people of all cultures and discovered that one of those fears is being attacked by animal claws. Around the same time, he saw his cat unsheath its claws and the two concepts merged. Although in the original script, the blades were fishing knives, not steak knives, as in the finished film. The ending that wound up in the final version of the film was not what director Wes Craven originally envisioned for the ending. He claimed that multiple ideas were pitched for how the ending would go, and Craven's original ending was more suggestive and thought provoking, but more conservative. But producer Bob Shea ultimately pushed very hard and got his twist ending in the final cut, but Wes Craven refused to use Shea's idea to have Freddy turn out to be the driver of the car. And I was watching actually a documentary on this. It's a docu-series called The Movies That Made Us, and they were talking about this, and basically the reason the way Marge is acting in the end scene is so confusing is because they actually also tacked that on, and it wasn't supposed to go with the rest of that ending, but one of the studios that they were screening the movie for really liked the sequence of her being pulled through the door, so they added it in there, and that's why that whole scene feels so fucking weird. Alright, on to info and ratings. Opening weekend, 1.27 million. Worldwide gross, 25.9 million. IMDb rating 7.4, Letterboxd rating 3.7, Rotten Tomato Critics score 94%, Rotten Tomato Audience score 84%. Personal rating 4 out of 5 stars. Praise for this movie. I do find this to be one of the more watchable horror movies, especially from the very formulaic era that it came from. Freddy Krueger is an incredible horror villain and is played very well by Robert Englund. Criticism: the ending has always felt weird and not fitting to the way the story was playing out. It feels as though they just used the ending that they wanted as a way to keep it open for sequels. And I just don't like when they do that to an otherwise good story that could have had a fitting ending just so that they can make more money. But I also get it because that's the reason they're doing all of this. All right, everyone. Thank you for stopping by. I do appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. Bye now.
What you hoped you would see. He's half blind, with hats tight, with all the dates release. For Footloose, The Dark Knight, a Kurt Russell, Brain Freeze, Rear Windows, and Gaslights. I'm Billy and you're Meg. Sharon Stone, the legs spread. The park starts with the eggs. It won't stop till you're dead. I'm here to welcome you to Brandon around the reviews. No method when I choose. It's Brandon around the reviews. You're looking for a man with no plans or programs. If you're looking for a man with no plans or programs, and he always leaves a chance to hold hands for romance, or you're looking for the look with an old man or cold hands, it's a creature of the night who heads for his spotlight. I'm here for my fleet, oh, for his diet. I'm here to welcome you to Brandon and Ronald.